Welcome to the Lectric Service Center. Today, we'll be showing you how to make an adjustment on your mechanical disc brakes. Before we begin, you'll need to make sure that you have some tools ready to go. You'll need torque wrenches, a socket wrench, a rotor truing fork, a flathead screwdriver, a 17mm long socket, a 15mm socket, a 5mm Allen socket, a T25 socket, a 5mm Allen wrench, and a 2.5mm Allen wrench, isopropyl alcohol, shop rags, a measurement caliper, and lastly, needle nose pliers. It is important to clean your rotor truing fork or crescent wrench with isopropyl alcohol and a shop rag. This will keep any grease or contaminants off of your brake rotor. We recommend making this adjustment with the bike on a bike stand. This will make the adjustment easier and safer. We also strongly encourage you to remove the battery of your e-bike while making this adjustment. This will ensure there is no voltage running through the bike while you're making this adjustment. Let's quickly go over the mechanical disc brake mechanisms, the barrel adjusters at the brake levers, and the barrel adjusters at the calipers. These barrel adjusters are used to make mid-ride adjustments to compensate for wear on your brake pads. Brake lever extension. A note, the brake lever should always be parallel with the handlebars to achieve optimal braking while riding. Brake actuation arm with cable retention screw. The actuation arm moves closer to the barrel adjusters at the caliper, which gives braking force to the brake rotor. The brake rotor is where the brake pads come in contact in order to stop the wheel from spinning. Static brake pad adjustment screw. This is the set screw for the static brake pad and will adjust the distance from the pad from the rotor when you turn it clockwise. When you turn it counterclockwise, it'll move it further away from the rotor. Before you begin, take your bike off the bike stand and set it on the ground in a vertical position. Loosen the axle nuts with a 17mm socket and loosen the torque arm retaining screw with a 4mm Allen wrench. Make sure the wheel is properly and fully seated into the dropouts. Then, tighten the axle nuts and torque arm retention screws until they are snug. Then, grab your torque wrench to torque the axle nuts to 35 Nm and the torque arm retaining screw to 5 Nm. If you are making this adjustment on the front wheel, there will be no torque arm to loosen, and you will need to loosen and tighten the axle nuts with a 15mm socket. Then, tighten the axle nuts until they are snug. Then, grab your torque wrench to torque the axle nuts to 35 Nm. You can now place your bike back onto the bike stand. Next, check the life of your brake pads and the trueness of your brake rotor. If your brake pads are worn, you will need to replace them, which we will go over in a bit. And if your rotor is not true, you will have to true it up, which we will go over later in the video. Take a look at your brake pads. If they need to be removed and replaced, you will need to reset the barrel adjuster positions by rotating them clockwise. You'll know the barrel adjusters at the caliper are reset when the silver ferrule stop is completely covered. You'll know the barrel adjusters at the brake lever are reset when they are in contact with the brake lever. Now, loosen the brake caliper mounting bolts and cable retention screws with a 5mm Allen wrench. After those are loose, you can straighten out the cotter pin with your needle nose pliers. Pull the cotter pin out, then pull the brake pads out. A new brake pad will have 4mm of brake pad material on it. If your brake pad has any material measuring over 2.7mm, they are okay to use until it hits that 2.7mm mark and will need to be replaced. To put your brake pads back into the caliper, drop your brake pads into place, insert the cotter pin and bend it back to at least 90 degrees. Then, tighten the caliper mounting bolts so that the static brake pad is 1/4 to 1/2 millimeter away from the rotor, and the dynamic brake pad is 1/2 millimeter to 1 millimeter away from the rotor. Now we can go through and diagnose the issue you may be experiencing with your brakes that would require a brake adjustment. One issue you may be experiencing is the brake levers pull all the way to the handlebars and are no longer parallel to the handlebar when the brake lever is pulled, and when the brake pad is engaged with the rotor. Another issue is that the barrel adjusters at the brake lever have been turned to increase the cable tension, or the barrel adjusters at the calipers have been turned out to increase cable tension, indicating brake pad wear. Another issue you might face is that the caliper actuation arm comes in contact with the barrel adjuster on the caliper, or the stopping point of the actuation arm is less than or equal to 10mm. In this scenario, the actuation arm is only 5.8mm away from the barrel adjusters. This is not okay. Now, you'll need to check your brake rotors for rubbing while the wheel is spinning. If you're experiencing any of these issues while diagnosing your brakes, you will need to adjust your brakes. Loosen the caliper mounting bolts with a 5mm Allen wrench until the caliper is able to move freely over the rotor. Now, loosen the cable retention bolt with a 5mm Allen wrench. Next, align the dynamic brake pad by moving it back and forth until it is 0.5 to 1mm from the rotor. You can now torque the caliper mounting bolts down to 8 Nm. Now, back to the brake cable, pull it tight so it is free of slack. Preload the actuation arm by pulling your cable tight and then pulling an additional 1 to 2mm to preload the actuation arm. Tighten down the cable retention screw. Be careful not to move the lever arm when tightening the pinch pull. This is important because the lever arm only has a small amount of useful motion. Next, you want to adjust the static brake pad. You can find this on the inside portion of the caliper. Unscrew the set screw with a 2mm Allen wrench. Use a 5mm Allen wrench to tighten the screw on the inside portion of the caliper until the brake pad almost touches the rotor, or is less than or equal to 1/4 to 1/2 mm away from the rotor. Then, torque the set screw back down to 2 Nm. If your rotor is rubbing after your brakes have been adjusted and set up, you will need to true your rotor. To do this, use a clean rotor truing fork or clean crescent wrench to align the rotor. Gently bend the rotor to true. Once you can spin the wheel and the rotor spins completely straight, you will know the rotor is true. A note: using too much force to true the rotor might cause damage, so use caution when performing this step. If after truing your rotor, the brake pads are still rubbing, repeat the process of loosening the caliper mounting bolt screws with your 5mm Allen wrench so that you can freely move the caliper over the rotor. Realign the caliper, ensuring that the dynamic brake pad is 1/4 to 1/2 mm away from the rotor, or is less than or equal to 1/4 to 1/2 mm away from the rotor. Then, tighten to 8 Nm. If you've completed all these steps and you're still experiencing issues with your brakes, you may need to take your bike to a bike shop to have the brake system looked at. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact our customer support team at contact@lectricebikes.com or give us a call at 602-715-0907. Thanks for watching.